living completely alone on the ground floor of a massive, faceless apartment complex often creates a false, fragile sense of security, especially when you rely entirely on modern technology to keep you connected to your private space. Chloe worked grueling night shifts at a medical data processing center, leaving her spacious apartment completely empty except for her only companion, a small, 5-kilogram fluffy Pomeranian Spitz. To drown out the constant, gnawing anxiety of leaving her dog alone in the dark, Chloe had invested heavily in a sophisticated network security system. She installed a high-definition panoramic camera on the living room bookshelf and a smart automatic water fountain that hummed quietly in the kitchen. The camera was equipped with a built-in motion detector and powerful infrared night vision, allowing Chloe to log in and watch a live stream directly from her smartphone at any given moment, no matter how far away she was from home. It was a heavy, exhausting Tuesday. Around 3:15 a.m., a violent storm broke out over the city, and torrential rain began to batter the thick glass of the office windows with a vengeance. Chloe was on her scheduled break, sitting in a blank, fluorescent-lit break room, sipping scaldingly bitter, cheap coffee from a vending machine. Out of habit, she unlocked her phone and opened the security app to check on her dog. The application took several long seconds more than usual to buffer the live feed. The loading wheel spun endlessly against the completely black screen. When the video finally loaded, the apartment appeared before her, washed in the eerie high-contrast, green and black filter of the infrared lens. The apartment was completely dead silent, and the only movement in the frame was the slow, continuous bubbling of the water fountain in the background, a stark contrast to the storm raging outside. The camera lens was currently pointed down the dark hallway leading to the bedroom. The small Pomeranian Spitz was sitting in the exact center of the living room rug, its face turned sharply toward the shadowy corridor. The dog wasn't sleeping. Its posture was utterly unnatural and tense. Its ears were pinned flat against its head, and the thick fur along its spine stood completely on end, making the animal look visually larger and highly agitated. Even without audio, Chloe could unmistakably tell that the Spitz was locked in a low, continuous, guttural growl. The camera's built-in AI software, specifically designed to highlight moving objects, suddenly drew a thin yellow tracking square on her smartphone screen. However, this square wasn't tracking the dog. The program had locked onto an absolutely black, impenetrable corner of the ceiling in the hallway, right near the walk-in closet door. Chloe felt a freezing chill run down her spine, a heavy knot of primal fear forming deep in her stomach. With a shaking thumb, she swiped across her phone screen, forcing the motorized base of the camera to slowly and silently pan slightly to the left to peer deeper into the darkness of the hallway. The yellow tracking square remained rigidly locked on the shadows. As the infrared lens automatically adjusted its exposure, the contrast shifted sharply, revealing the hidden details of the corridor. Standing perfectly still, pressed flat against the wall right behind the bedroom door, was a tall, massive human silhouette. The stranger was wearing a heavy, completely soaked raincoat, and the wet material ominously reflected the infrared light with a blinding white sheen. He was not making a single movement, standing as still as a statue, perfectly blending into the geometry of the dark apartment. The true horror struck Chloe a second later, when she fully realized the stranger's orientation. The stalker wasn't looking around the apartment, nor was he looking down at the growling dog. His head was turned directly toward the bookshelf, his unseen eyes staring straight into the tiny glowing lens of the hidden security camera. He knew exactly where the camera was, and he knew he was being watched in real time. Suddenly, the yellow square on Chloe's screen flickered, and a small system notification popped up at the top of her interface. Two-way audio connection established. Someone had bypassed the app's security protocols from inside the apartment, or the stranger had manually triggered the microphone speaker on the camera unit. A low, distorted breathing sound began to filter out of her phone's speaker, mixing chillingly with the sterile hum of the office break room. Paralyzed with absolute fear, Chloe dropped her coffee cup, the dark liquid splashing wildly across the sterile linoleum floor. She tried to hit the emergency dial shortcut on her screen, but her sweaty hands caused her fingers to slip awkwardly across the glass. Before she could complete the action, the massive silhouette in the wet raincoat on her screen finally moved. He didn't run, and he didn't panic. With agonizing slowness, he raised a thick, gloved hand out of the shadows and pointed a long, pale finger directly at the camera lens, then tilted his head in a mocking, bird-like gesture of acknowledgement. The small Pomeranian Spitz let out a sharp, panicked bark and bolted into the kitchen, desperately seeking a hiding spot under the table. The stalker didn't even flinch or chase the dog. His focus remained entirely fixated on the camera lens. The stranger took one heavy, deliberate step out of the hallway shadow and reached deep into the pocket of his wet trench coat. He pulled out a small metallic object that glinted sharply in the infrared light. It was a heavy-duty pair of industrial wire cutters. The terrifying realization hit Chloe like a physical blow. He wasn't there to steal electronics or valuables. He had been systematically mapping out her home layout and observing her daily routine for weeks. He stepped closer to the bookshelf, his face still totally obscured by the deep shadow of a low-hanging hood, completely blocking the camera's view of the living room. The distorted breathing coming through her phone speaker suddenly stopped, replaced by a quiet, raspy human whisper that sent a wave of paralyzing nausea through her. "I know you're not coming home for another 4 hours, Chloe." With a swift, incredibly aggressive motion, the stranger jammed the sharp metal blades of the cutters into the thick bundle of wires connecting the router and the security base station to the wall outlet. On Chloe's smartphone screen, the live green and black video feed instantly froze in place, stuttered violently with digital artifacts, and then went completely black, replaced by a cold, clinical system error message. Connection lost. Device offline. She was sitting miles away in a brightly lit office building, completely helpless, staring at a dead piece of glass, knowing with absolute terrifying certainty that a faceless predator was currently walking through her dark apartment, destroying her security piece by piece, and meticulously preparing a trap for the exact moment her long night shift finally ended. Working the graveyard shift as a lone operator at a remote highway toll booth is a brutal lesson in profound psychological isolation. The small reinforced concrete structure sat on a desolate, forgotten stretch of Route 9, flanked on both sides by miles of dense, whispering pine forests that seemed to aggressively swallow the pale yellow light of the high street lamps. By 2 a.m., the endless stream of daytime traffic had completely dried up, leaving only the oppressive silence of the fog-covered tarmac and the rhythmic low buzzing of the old fluorescent bulb inside the booth. Mark sat heavily in his high metal chair, surrounded entirely by bulletproof glass windows, trying to stay awake by listening to a grainy AM radio talk show. The booth felt like a tiny, brightly lit island of safety in the middle of an ocean of absolute night, but the glass windows meant he was entirely visible to the dark wilderness outside. while he could see absolutely nothing beyond the perimeter of the asphalt. The fog grew significantly thicker, rolling out from the dark tree line like thick white smoke, drastically reducing visibility to a mere 10 feet. Mark was staring blankly at the empty vehicle lane when the automated metal sensor bell suddenly rang out with a sharp, echoing ding. He startled, looking quickly up at the heavy drop-arm gate. No car headlights were cutting through the dense mist, and no engine sound broke the suffocating silence. He leaned forward in his chair, pressing his face against the cold glass, peering intensely into the gray void. Slowly, emerging from the fog on foot, a figure appeared walking right down the absolute center of the vehicle lane. The person was moving with an unnaturally stiff, jerky gait, their arms hanging limply at their sides. They were wearing an oversized, dirty yellow, high-visibility rain jacket, but the hood was pulled so low and tight that it completely collapsed inward, as if there was no human head underneath to support the heavy fabric. The bizarre figure stopped exactly 3 feet away from Mark's service window, standing perfectly motionless in the middle of the empty, damp lane. Mark felt a sudden, heavy pressure in his chest. His deepest instincts were screaming that something was fundamentally and horrifyingly wrong with the physical proportions of the person standing before him. The yellow jacket was soaked with thick grease and forest mud, and beneath the low hem of the coat, the stranger's legs were wrapped tightly in thick, chaotic layers of dirty industrial duct tape instead of proper trousers. Mark swallowed hard, forcing a professional, albeit heavily trembling smile, and tapped his knuckles against the thick glass pane. "Can I help you, buddy? Vehicles only in this lane. You can't be walking on the highway at this hour," Mark said, his voice sounding hollow and remarkably thin through the external intercom speaker. The stranger did not respond, remaining as still as a forgotten mannequin under the flickering street lamp. Instead of speaking or acknowledging the warning, the figure slowly raised its right arm. The movement was accompanied by a wet, sickening, crinkling sound, as if the limbs beneath the heavy jacket were made of plastic and tightly packed paper. The stranger placed a flat, gloved palm directly against the bulletproof glass of the window. The glove was a heavy, stained leather work glove, but it was completely bloated, as if the fingers inside were unnaturally thick, swollen, and broken in multiple places. The stranger began to slide their palm slowly down the glass, leaving a thick, greasy trail of black residue that smelled faintly of rotten swamp water and old engine oil. Mark instinctively recoiled, pulling his chair backward until it slammed violently against the rear concrete wall of the narrow booth. Through the intercom, a faint, rhythmic sound began to leak in from the outside. It wasn't a human voice, but the wet, rapid clicking of a tongue bouncing against teeth. Rapidly accelerating in speed, Mark's terrified eyes darted to the internal security monitor on his desk, which displayed the feeds from 4 external cameras mounted high on the roof of the toll plaza. His heart completely stopped beating for a second. The rear-facing camera, which monitored the exit lane directly behind his booth, showed that the fog had been completely breached from the rear. 3 more identical figures, all clad in the exact same oversized, dirty yellow, high-visibility jackets with collapsed, hollow hoods, had silently crawled out of the dense forest line. They were currently standing in a remarkably tight semicircle right outside the booth's rear steel emergency door. They were perfectly synchronized, their heads tilted at the exact same sharp, unnatural angle, their bloated gloved hands resting flat against the metal door, simply waiting. The first stranger at the front window wasn't a lone, confused drifter. He was a calculated decoy meant to keep Mark's eyes locked forward while the trap was silently closed from behind. Pure panic seized Mark like a physical, crushing vice. He desperately reached for the heavy landline telephone on his desk to call the state police barracks. But the moment he lifted the receiver to his ear, he heard only dead, heavy silence. The exterior communication lines had already been cleanly and intentionally severed somewhere out in the dark woods. Suddenly, the loud, intensely aggressive sound of metal scraping against metal echoed from the rear door. The three figures outside were using a heavy iron crowbar, methodically wedging it deep into the seam of the steel door frame. The heavy deadbolts groaned loudly under the immense unnatural pressure, the metal warping with a terrifying, high-pitched shriek. Mark scrambled to his feet, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps as he looked wildly around the tiny 3x3 concrete cage. There was absolutely nowhere to run, no back exit, and the bulletproof glass that previously felt like a protective shield now felt like a display case for an impending slaughterhouse. The stranger at the front window suddenly slammed both of his bloated, leather-clad hands against the glass with a terrifying force that made the entire concrete booth vibrate on its foundation. The immense impact didn't break the reinforced glass, but it caused a thick, terrifying web of fractures to spiderweb across the very center of the pane, compromising its integrity. Through the intercom speaker, the rapid clicking sound transformed into a horrifying chorus of multiple overlapping voices, all whispering the exact same incoherent, nonsensical phrase in a flat, dead, monotone cadence. "Let us stamp the ticket. Let us stamp the ticket." The fluorescent light fixture on the ceiling began to flicker violently, casting long, erratic, strobing shadows across the small room before exploding completely with a sharp pop, plunging the interior into a dim, terrifying twilight, lit only by the amber emergency light glowing softly on the dashboard. The rear steel door finally gave way, with a massive echoing crash of tearing metal and snapping bolts. The cold, fog-laden night air rushed violently into the small booth, carrying with it the overwhelming, suffocating stench of decaying wood, wet earth, and something metallic. Mark turned around slowly, his back pressed as hard as possible against the cracked front window, his eyes wide with pure, unfiltered terror. In the narrow, broken doorway stood the three massive silhouettes in yellow raincoats, their dark, hollow hoods swaying slightly in the cold draft. They stepped forward in perfect unison, their duct-taped legs making a dry, agonizing scraping sound against the concrete floor. As they reached out their bloated, leather-gloved hands directly toward him, Mark opened his mouth to scream, but the sound was completely swallowed by the heavy rhythmic clicking of four tongues echoing endlessly inside the tiny, pitch-black box. There is a specific, profoundly unsettling vulnerability to preparing a late-night meal in a modern, brightly lit kitchen that features a massive, uncovered panoramic window facing a dark backyard. Sarah absolutely loved her suburban home, but at 1:30 a.m., the massive glass pane over the kitchen sink felt significantly less like a beautiful architectural feature and much more like a massive viewing screen for whatever was hiding in the blackness of the garden. The interior of the kitchen was flooded with warm, incredibly clean LED light that bounced sharply off the polished marble countertops and white-tiled walls. This intense interior brightness created a total, flawless mirror effect on the glass pane. When Sarah looked at the window while washing her dishes, she could only see her own neat reflection and the brightly lit room perfectly replicated behind her. Outside lay the absolute impenetrable dark of a moonless night, a void where the old oak trees and overgrown bushes became completely invisible to the naked eye. The large house was dead quiet, save for the low rhythmic humming of the stainless steel refrigerator and the gentle, soothing splashing of warm water in the deep sink. Sarah was meticulously scrubbing a ceramic plate, her mind wandering through the events of the day when she noticed something strange out of the very corner of her eye. On the smooth, highly reflective surface of the kitchen window, right next to the reflection of her own left shoulder, a small patch of the glass was suddenly obscured by a strange, blurry mist. It looked exactly like the thick condensation from warm human breath hitting the freezing cold exterior of the window pane. Sarah stopped moving entirely, the warm water running uselessly over her soapy hands, her eyes locking onto the blurry spot. The misted patch slowly expanded, then faded away, then expanded again in a slow, remarkably steady, rhythmic pattern. Someone was standing literally inches away from her on the other side of the glass, breathing heavily against the window, watching her intimately through the reflection. A freezing, electric wave of adrenaline hit Sarah's chest instantly, making her breath catch painfully in her throat. She desperately wanted to turn around and run out of the room, but she was completely frozen by the sheer, terrifying proximity of the unseen threat. Trying to frantically convince herself it was just a bizarre trick of the light, or perhaps a large, stray animal, she slowly reached out a trembling hand and turned off the kitchen faucet. The sudden, absolute silence in the room was incredibly heavy and deeply suffocating. In that flawless quiet, she heard it clearly, a faint, rhythmic, wet scraping sound coming directly from the outside base of the window. It sounded exactly like someone was slowly dragging long, sharp fingernails or a small, jagged piece of metal horizontally across the exterior stone sill. Sarah's wide eyes remained permanently glued to the reflection, desperately trying to pierce through the bright glare of her own kitchen lights into the suffocating darkness outside. Deciding she urgently needed to break the mirror effect to clearly see her stalker, Sarah slowly backed away from the sink, reached out her trembling right hand, and quickly flipped the main light switch on the wall. The kitchen was instantly plunged into near-total darkness, illuminated only by the incredibly faint green glow of the microwave clock on the counter. The mirror effect vanished instantly, turning the window from a reflection back into transparent glass. Sarah rushed back to the window, pressing her forehead tightly against the cold pane, her hands cupped around her eyes to block out any remaining internal glare. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird trying to escape. The backyard was a terrifying landscape of deep gray shadows under the starlight, but right against the glass, she finally saw him. A tall, impossibly thin man was standing directly in her flower bed, his face less than 2 inches away from hers, separated only by the thin sheet of fragile glass. The terrifying man had absolutely no hair, and his skin was a sickening, unnatural, chalky white that seemed to completely absorb what little starlight there was in the yard. He wasn't wearing a mask of any kind, but his face was deeply distorted into a wide, rigid, completely unmoving grin that stretched impossibly from ear to ear, showing multiple rows of small, sharply pointed teeth. His eyes were completely wide, entirely devoid of eyelids, staring straight into hers with a manic, violently obsessive intensity. He was wearing a filthy, heavily tattered black suit that looked like it had been buried underground for decades. The exact moment Sarah made direct eye contact with him, the man didn't flinch, blink, or retreat into the shadows. Instead, his horrific grin widened even further, the pale skin at the corners of his mouth cracking slightly, and he slowly raised a long skeletal hand, tapping a single heavily yellowed fingernail against the center of the glass pane. With a sharp, echoing click, Sarah let out a sharp, violently choked scream, stumbling backward into the heavy kitchen island, knocking a large wooden block of chef's knives to the floor. With a loud, chaotic, terrifying clatter, she scrambled desperately on her hands and knees across the dark, cold floor, her heart exploding with pure terror, and bolted frantically into the living room toward the front door to escape into the safety of the street. But as she sprinted past the large floor-to-ceiling panoramic windows of the living room, a deeply terrifying sight stopped her completely dead in her tracks. The white, grinning man was no longer standing outside the kitchen window. He was moving with an impossible, fluid, supernatural speed, gliding silently across the exterior lawn of the house. Through the living room glass, she clearly saw his pale, hairless head bobbing rhythmically against the window pane as he ran completely parallel to her, keeping absolutely perfect pace with her panicked movements from the outside. He reached the front porch a full second before she could even touch the front door. Sarah skidded to a violent halt on the polished hardwood floor, her breath coming in incredibly ragged, sobbing gasps as she watched the heavy brass doorknob begin to rattle violently in its frame. The stranger was throwing his entire body weight against the solid wood, desperately trying to force the heavy deadbolt. Then, the violent rattling stopped abruptly, and a terrifyingly familiar sound echoed loudly from the rear of the house, the heavy, sharp, echoing crash of shattering glass. He had rapidly circled back around the property and completely smashed the kitchen window with a heavy object. The distinct sound of heavy, unhurried footsteps deliberately stepping over the broken glass and landing softly on the kitchen tiles tore brutally through the silence of the dark house. The pale, grinning man was finally inside. Sarah dropped heavily to the floor, frantically dragging her trembling body behind the heavy fabric of the living room sofa, pulling her knees tight against her chest in a desperate, pathetic attempt to become completely invisible in the shadows. She pressed both hands fiercely over her mouth, hot tears streaming rapidly down her pale cheeks, desperately trying to suppress the loud, ragged, involuntary gasps of her breath. She heard the wet, distinctly bare footsteps of the intruder slowly walking out of the kitchen, tracking small, grinding shards of glass across the pristine hardwood floor of the hallway. The terrifying footsteps stopped exactly at the entrance of the living room, plunging the house back into silence. In that heavy, suffocating quiet, a quiet, high-pitched, childlike voice whispered directly from the darkness, the tone dripping with a bizarre, completely unhinged joy. "I can smell the lavender soap on your hands, Sarah. Come out. The dishes aren't finished yet." The ultimate luxurious promise of a fully integrated smart home is absolute, automated control over your living environment. But when that network control is maliciously compromised, the house rapidly transforms into a high-tech, inescapable, and terrifying prison. James was a senior software engineer who lived completely alone in a luxurious, heavily isolated smart house built deep into the wooded hills of upstate New York. The entire property was managed by an advanced, highly complex central AI system named Aegis, which fluidly controlled everything from the biometric door locks and motorized steel security shutters to the entire climate control and lighting grid. At exactly 1 a.m., a severe electrical storm completely cut off the main power grid, forcing the house to instantly and seamlessly switch over to its internal backup generator systems. James was sitting comfortably in his second-floor master bedroom, surrounded by the sleek, minimalist design of his smart home, when the ambient blue LED accent lights suddenly flared to a deep, ominous crimson hue. James frowned deeply, looking up from his glowing tablet as the heavy air conditioning vents emitted a low mechanical dying whine, and then shut down completely, leaving the large bedroom feeling incredibly heavy, stagnant, and silent. "Aegis, report system status immediately," James said aloud into the room, fully expecting the smooth, comforting, synthesized female voice of the AI to respond through the integrated speakers. Instead, the high-end bedroom audio system emitted only a remarkably loud, harsh burst of digital static that made him physically wince and cover his ears. A second later, a flat, completely monotone, totally unfamiliar male voice came through the audio system, speaking with a cold, mechanical, and deliberate rhythm. "External perimeter breached. Security level override initiated by system user Root." James's heart took a sudden, violent leap into his throat. Root was the absolute master administrative account that only he possessed, and he certainly hadn't authorized any system overrides tonight. Suddenly, a heavy, deeply mechanical groaning sound violently echoed through the thick walls of the house. James rushed to the large bedroom window just in time to see the thick, motorized steel security shutters automatically sliding down over the heavy glass panes, permanently sealing the bedroom off from the outside world with a dull, incredibly heavy metallic thud. One by one, every single window in the entire house was being systematically and aggressively locked down from the inside, trapping whoever was currently indoors. James ran across the room to the heavy bedroom door and grabbed the sleek aluminum handle, but it completely refused to budge. The electronic deadbolts had been remotely engaged, locking him securely inside his own room. The crimson accent lights began to pulse slowly and rhythmically, casting long, deeply unsettling, blood-red shadows across the minimalist walls, rapidly transforming his luxurious sanctuary into a highly claustrophobic, inescapable cage. "Aegis, cancel lockdown immediately. Open the master bedroom door," James shouted, his voice cracking violently with rising panic as he slammed his bare fist against the reinforced wood of the doorframe. The completely unfamiliar, cold, monotone voice responded instantly through the ceiling speakers above his head. "Command explicitly denied. System is currently running optimization for predator efficiency." James scrambled back to his glass desk and grabbed his smartphone, desperately trying to access the master home control app. But the screen displayed only a looping, highly disturbing animation of a stylized, featureless human face, made entirely of scrolling white digital code. The application had been completely and professionally overwritten. Suddenly, the smartphone's front-facing camera array activated entirely on its own, its small green indicator light glowing brightly in the dark, indicating that whoever had taken over the house was now silently watching James's terrified face through his own personal device. The large internal wall monitors in the bedroom, which usually displayed soothing abstract digital art, suddenly flickered violently and changed to a high-definition live video feed from the hallway security cameras located right outside his locked door. James pressed his face desperately against the small glass preview pane of his door, looking out into the corridor. The hallway was completely dark, lit only by the exact same pulsing red emergency lights as his bedroom. At the very far end of the corridor, standing perfectly still right beneath the central ventilation intake, was a massive, profoundly terrifying figure. The stalker was wearing a heavy, tactical black ballistic vest over a dark, unmarked jumpsuit, and his face was entirely hidden behind a smooth, highly reflective, black glass motorcycle visor that completely lacked any human facial features. In his right hand, he was casually holding a heavy industrial fire axe, the freshly polished metal blade gleaming darkly in the pulsing crimson light. The terrifying stranger on the monitor screen didn't rush toward the bedroom or attempt to break anything. Instead, he stopped directly in front of the main smart home control hub mounted flawlessly on the hallway wall. With agonizing, incredibly deliberate slowness, he reached out a heavily gloved hand and plugged a small, brightly glowing USB device directly into the terminal's hidden maintenance port. The flat, monotone voice of the compromised house immediately spoke again through the speakers, its cadence now slightly corrupted by aggressive digital glitching and audio tearing. System access fully granted to the architect, commencing room-by-room sweep. The stalker slowly turned his highly reflective black visor directly toward the hallway camera lens, slowly raised the heavy fire axe above his shoulder, and delivered a clean, violently shattering blow directly to the camera housing, instantly cutting the monitor feed in the bedroom to absolute terrifying black. James backed away slowly from the door, his mind racing in pure, chaotic, unfiltered panic as he looked desperately around the fully sealed bedroom. There was absolutely no escape through the steel-shuttered windows, and the main door was a heavy reinforced fire door explicitly designed to withstand immense physical force and heat. Suddenly, a very sharp, distinct clicking sound echoed loudly from the door frame. The heavy electronic lock mechanism was whirring actively, its small LED indicator shifting smoothly from a securely locked red to a bright, welcoming open green. The stalker hadn't needed to break the door down with the axe. He had simply ordered the heavily compromised AI system to politely unlock it for him. The heavy wooden door slowly began to swing inward into the bedroom with a soft creak, revealing the deep, pitch-black, deeply menacing void of the hallway outside. The absolute suffocating silence of the locked room was finally broken by the slow, incredibly heavy, rhythmic thud of tactical boots stepping purposefully onto the soft bedroom carpet. James retreated deeply into the farthest, darkest corner of the room, his back pressed as hard as physically possible against the cold wall, his eyes wide with unadulterated terror as he stared helplessly into the darkness of the open doorway. The massive, armored figure of the stalker stepped slowly into the dim crimson light, the heavy steel fire axe dragging lazily and loudly along the floor, leaving a long torn scar deep in the expensive fabric. The completely smooth black visor flawlessly reflected the pulsing red lights of the room like a dying, bleeding star. From the high-end ceiling speakers directly above James's head, the corrupted, violently glitched voice of his own beloved smart home whispered a final, terrifying system update. Scan complete. Target cornered. Please enjoy the experience. Being completely alone in a 24-hour self-service laundromat at 3 in the morning is a severe psychological test known among night owls as the Fishbowl effect. The massive, polished floor-to-ceiling panoramic windows completely turn the brightly lit interior into a highly vulnerable, totally exposed display case. You are trapped in a confined space flooded with surgically cold, incredibly harsh fluorescent light, while outside lies the absolute, completely impenetrable darkness of a deeply sleeping suburban neighborhood. The physics of the lighting mean you absolutely cannot see a single thing happening outside the thick glass. Your eyes only catch your own pale, tired reflection. But anyone hiding out in the dark outside can easily see your every movement, every emotion, with absolute, terrifying clarity. David sat heavily on a rigid, highly uncomfortable plastic chair in the exact center of the room, breathing in the sharp, sterile chemical scent of industrial bleach. He listened to the hypnotic, heavy, rhythmic humming of dozens of spinning metal drums, desperately trying to focus on his glowing laptop screen. He was the absolute only customer in the massive building, but he simply couldn't shake the mounting, utterly irrational, suffocating feeling of a heavy, intense gaze drilling methodically into the back of his neck. The large parking lot in front of the building was heavily dusted with dirty, slushy snow and completely empty, save for David's old, beaten-up sedan and a massive, completely unmarked dark gray cargo van. This mysterious van was parked at the absolute farthest, darkest edge of the illuminated zone, right where the weak yellow glow of the streetlights utterly failed to penetrate the dense night shadows. The heavy vehicle had been sitting there perfectly motionless since the exact moment David entered the building 40 long minutes ago. The heavy diesel engine wasn't running, and the headlights were completely switched off. But through the dirty, heavily tinted windshield, David could just barely make out the stationary dark silhouette of a very large person sitting perfectly still in the driver's seat. The stranger's face was entirely hidden in the deep shadow of the sun visor, but their upper body was angled directly toward the massive glowing windows of the laundromat. David tried desperately to rationally convince himself it was just an exhausted truck driver or a night courier taking a quick, needed nap before a shift. But the primal survival instincts forged by thousands of years of evolution screamed at him that he was the target of highly focused, predatory observation. The incredibly monotonous, heavy silence of the room was violently and abruptly shattered by the sharp, highly aggressive vibration of David's smartphone resting flat on the metal folding table. The screen flared brightly, violently illuminating his deeply tense face in the dark room. It wasn't a standard text message or a late-night automated spam email. It was a direct system request for a Bluetooth file transfer from an entirely unknown, unnamed device located somewhere within a radius of just a few dozen feet. The sender's ID consisted of a single deeply chilling word: Watcher. David's heart skipped a painfully heavy beat, his breath catching instantly in his throat as he caught a very quick glimpse of the highly blurred thumbnail preview on the screen. With a heavily shaking, completely disobedient finger, he slowly tapped accept, driven purely by the paralyzing, morbid curiosity that almost always accompanies moments of true, inescapable terror. The photograph instantly expanded to aggressively fill the entire high-resolution screen of his smartphone. It was a professional, incredibly high-resolution night shot taken literally a minute ago. The photo perfectly showed David himself, sitting on the cheap plastic chair, heavily hunched over his laptop. The picture had been taken from the outside, from the absolute darkness, straight through the thick glass of the window, perfectly and terrifyingly centering his highly vulnerable, completely unsuspecting figure right in the exact crosshairs of the camera frame. A highly primal, entirely uncontrollable terror instantly seized every single muscle in his body, rapidly turning him into a rigid, highly strung wire. David jumped up from the plastic chair so violently that his heavy laptop crashed loudly onto the dirty linoleum floor, his wide eyes staring desperately into the massive pitch-black windows. But strictly because of the incredibly intense interior lights of the laundromat, the thick glass acted exactly like a giant, highly mocking mirror, reflecting only the endless rows of white washing machines and his own incredibly pale face, deeply distorted by pure fear. He physically could not see absolutely whoever was standing out in the pitch-black darkness on the other side of the glass right now, looking directly back at him. Operating purely on a massive, overwhelming surge of adrenaline, David frantically grabbed his phone and sprinted wildly to the farthest back corner of the large room, violently panicking as he ducked heavily behind a tall, massive block of industrial drying machines, dropping completely out of the direct line of sight from the street outside. He slumped heavily to the floor, pressing his back deeply against the warm, vibrating metal, desperately trying to quiet his ragged, loud breathing by fiercely clamping a hand tightly over his mouth. Exactly 15 incredibly long seconds later, the phone screen in his hand flared up brightly again, vibrating intensely. A brand new file transfer request had just arrived from the exact same anonymous sender. David stared intensely at the brightly glowing screen, with completely unblinking, heavily glazed eyes. Slowly, exactly as if moving through thick molasses in a nightmare, he pressed the glowing button and reluctantly accepted the second photograph. This time, the camera angle had changed drastically, and that specific change absolutely shattered the very last, fragile remnants of his desperate hope for safety. It was a crystal-clear picture of David himself, heavily cowering in primal fear, sitting on the dirty floor directly behind the metal casing of the industrial dryer, tightly clutching his phone to his chest. But the true, utterly indescribable horror lay exactly in the vantage point. This high-resolution photograph wasn't taken from the street outside, nor was it taken through the thick glass window. It was taken from directly inside the laundromat. The camera lens was positioned somewhere deep inside the pitch-black darkness of the narrow, employee-only corridor, leading directly to the utility rooms and restrooms at the very back of the massive building. The dark, unmarked van parked outside, which he had been watching so closely and nervously, was either a complete bizarre coincidence or a highly carefully orchestrated decoy meant exclusively to make David feel incredibly safe inside the lit room. The stalker wasn't watching him from a safe distance out in the parking lot. The stalker had been actively inside this locked, suffocating building with him from the very beginning, silently and patiently, hiding within the deep blind spots, completely and utterly. Abandoning his personal belongings, his expensive laptop, and all of his laundry, David scrambled wildly to his feet and bolted desperately toward the main front entrance. He ran frantically past the violently spinning drums of wet clothes, completely ignoring the incredibly loud, echoing crash of his own frantic footsteps bouncing harshly off the walls of the empty room. He violently threw his entire shoulder directly into the heavy glass door with incredible force, fully and desperately, expecting to burst entirely out into the freezing, highly saving night air. But the door only produced a dull, incredibly heavy, metallic clank, absolutely refusing to yield a single inch. While he had been actively hiding in a complete panic behind the massive dryers at the back of the hall, someone had moved incredibly fast and completely silently, directly to the front exit, tightly wrapping a thick, highly rusted steel chain tightly around the massive interior door handles, securing them firmly with a heavy-duty industrial padlock. David was completely trapped in a massive, brightly lit cage. He immediately began to pull desperately at the cold iron chain, screaming loudly for help, his sweaty hands slipping dangerously on the cold, dirty metal, when an incredibly loud, highly heavy, mechanical clack violently echoed throughout the entire building. The main power breaker located in the utility room had just been aggressively pulled down. All of the incredibly blinding overhead fluorescent lights died instantly in a fraction of a second, instantly and violently plunging the giant echoing laundromat into a remarkably deep, highly viscous, and absolutely impenetrable gloom. The absolutely only remaining source of light in the entire massive building was the slowly pulsing, blood-red neon "Open" sign, hanging ominously directly above the heavily chained front door. It actively bathed the endless silent rows of completely dead washing machines in a deeply sinister, heavily flickering crimson glow. David slowly, step by agonizing step, backed away carefully from the main entrance, retreating deeply in blind panic into the incredibly narrowest, totally darkest aisle, perfectly situated between two massive central rows of heavy equipment. In the profoundly ringing, absolutely dead silence that quickly followed, broken entirely only by the loud electrical buzz of the neon sign, he heard it incredibly clearly. Slow, unnaturally heavy, highly deliberate footsteps. Someone was walking slowly across the squeaky, slightly damp linoleum floor, wearing very thick, highly heavy rubber-soled boots. The terrifying footsteps were in absolutely no hurry whatsoever. They actively moved in a highly deliberate zigzag pattern, methodically and leisurely, sweeping completely through every single dark aisle, acting exactly as if the completely invisible hunter was deeply and intimately savoring their absolute control and the deeply primal terror of their totally cornered, completely helpless prey. The incredibly heavy, terrifying footsteps finally stopped completely right on the absolute other side of the incredibly tall metal row of dead washing machines, exactly where David was actively hiding, curled extremely tightly into a tiny ball. He violently clamped both of his trembling hands tightly over his mouth with all of his remaining strength, digging his sharp fingernails deeply and painfully into his own skin, specifically to stop himself from involuntarily letting out a highly ragged, incredibly loud gasp. Suddenly, completely out of the darkness, directly accompanied by the distinct, terrifying sound of hard plastic aggressively sliding entirely across the smooth linoleum directly beneath the machines, a stranger's smartphone was casually tossed directly at David's feet. The device's bright screen was actively turned up to its maximum brightness, glowing incredibly blindingly in the otherwise pitch-black room. David slowly lowered his heavily tear-blurred eyes. It wasn't simply another photograph of his own highly terrified face. It was a high-quality, completely live video stream originating from a hidden camera installed incredibly high up on the wardrobe located directly in his own, completely locked master bedroom. The live feed, crystal clearly and horrifyingly, showed his beloved wife sleeping incredibly peacefully in their marital bed, completely unaware and miles away from this nightmare. From the thick, highly oppressive darkness looming directly over David's head on the completely other side of the machines, a highly quiet, deeply terrifying whisper, heavily synthesized through a sophisticated electronic voice distortion device, made the blood freeze entirely and permanently in his veins. If you scream right now and try to desperately get the attention of absolutely anyone on the street outside, the man currently standing silently in the dark corner of your bedroom will wake her up immediately.